Hi everyone.
Hi everybody, welcome. Come on in, get yourself comfortable. What we are, 50 people, 55, that was a massive jump. In the 60s, nearly at 100. So welcome everybody. In traditional style, tell us what you've had for your tea. So you can tell us, like I say, what you've had for your tea or what your favourite tea is, because everybody has the favourite tea, don't they? You know what I mean? The thing that you think, oh, if I could have anything, I'd have that. Louise has had crisps at Centre Parks. Excellent.
Like
Oh, slimming tea. Yep. So we're at nearly 200 people. I was just saying, welcome. Tell us what you've had for your tea. Tell us what your favourite tea is. If you haven't had anything, what's your favourite tea? That's okay. And if you've been to every single webinar, fantastic. It's really, really good to have you here. If this is your first webinar, come in, don't worry, put your feet up. We can't see you. Hopefully you can see us. If you can't, stick something in the chat. It means that Omar needs to fix something.
Okay, so we are welcome to our 12th webinar tonight. I had to look at the slide then to remind myself. It seems like forever we've been doing these webinars. Just from the chat there, I heard lots of people are camping, and I'm kind of camping at the moment, but not quite in a tent. I'm in a caravan, so hence the background is slightly different for me this week. But the other thing that's slightly different for everybody this week is that we have a guest. So if you are a regular attender of the webinars, you'll recognise the Social Work Student Connect team are here, but that Jason has joined us tonight. So Jason, do you want to give us a quick introduction to yourself?
Yeah, my name's Jason. I'm a social worker, and I'm here to talk a little bit about the topic of shame, which I'm really looking forward to. I'm so chuffed to be part of these webinars. I've seen a few of them. I saw Safeguarding Survivor, Annie, and the Anti-Racist Practice webinar, and I think they're fantastic. You're all doing a really good job, so thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for joining us, Jason. And we saw some of your tweets on shame, and it's partly why we decided to do a webinar on shame, because we'll look out all the time for new ideas for content. And so we're really pleased that you've joined us tonight. And Jason will be doing the practitioner spotlight later on, and then we'll join together our conversation, I suppose, around the theory base of shame. So the title for tonight's webinar is Shame, the Theory Base, Too Often Ignored in Social Work. So what we're going to be looking at is, I suppose, shame as what I would see as the elephant in the room, the thing that is there all of the time in social work, but that we don't necessarily talk about enough. Certainly we don't talk about it enough. Sometimes we don't talk about it at all. In our 10 minutes together before we opened the webinar for everybody, then we were chatting with the Student Connect team about how much teaching they have on shame, and it's very little, if any. So tonight we're asking you in this poll here, that some of you can see the polls, I know, and some can't. We're asking you, do you feel that shame is too often ignored in social work? And already we've had over 100 votes, and 85% of you feel that shame is too often ignored in social work. Because these webinars have been, from the outset, when we devised the webinars, they were supposed to be all about helping us to keep theory and reflection connected with our practice. So tonight we're going to be looking at the theory base of shame, but much like we had last week, there'll be some theory, but there'll be a bit of practice and a lot of experience. So Jason's going to be sharing his thoughts and experiences, and I'm going to be sharing my thoughts and experiences. So 225 of you, it's gone up now, 230 people have voted in the poll tonight. 83% of you feel that shame is too often ignored in social work. 3% of you think that it's not ignored, and 13% aren't sure. So that's the poll that we're going to start off with tonight. What we're going to be doing is looking, as I say, at the theory base of shame in social work. So just as a bit of an introduction to the topic, then reading around some of the literature and some of the theory about shame, then shame was described in the 1990s by Sheff as the master emotion. I've got to point out that there's a potential sexism within that language, but I suppose what Sheff was saying there was that shame is the main emotion and it's the driving emotional force. But Van Vliet in 2008 said that shame isn't studied in academic settings and that there's really no theory base around shame, is what was said in 2008. I very much feel that the impact of shame is underestimated in social work practice, and that's one of the reasons that I wanted to do the webinar tonight. So what we're going to be looking at is essentially the what, the why and the how of shame. So we're going to look at what is shame, why do people experience shame, and how can we respond to that shame as social workers. But as we look at the what, the why and the how, then that is going to bring in additional questions such as who, when and where. And thinking about questions, that word questions has just reminded me that I didn't say to you at the beginning, as I should have done. If people have any tech questions, please put them into the Q&A because the chat tends to get very busy and Omar can't pick them up in the chat. So if you have any tech questions, pop them in the Q&A. If you have any questions for Jason or I, pop those into the Q&A, and Chris is looking at that tonight and she'll help to make sure that we answer as many of those as possible. Generally though, you might want to just have conversations with one another in the chat, and I know it's one of the things that people really value about attending the webinars live is the option to be able to connect with other social workers as you hear through the content. So we will be looking at the what, the why and the how of shame. I think though we can't do a webinar looking at shame without mentioning Breanne Brown, the American social worker, who I think has really brought a spotlight, I suppose, if you like, onto shame in social work. So there has been, since that initial 2008 quote from Van Vliet, there has been a considerable growth in the theory base around shame. I would say, looking at the literature, most of it is since 2015, so very recent. And there's recent claims there that there is a substantial body of work now and considerable attention from social work researchers and practitioners in terms of the theory base of shame in social work. I know that lots of you who attend the webinars have a set of social work theory cards, and I suppose one of the ways that I can kind of tell whether a theory is very new is about whether it's in which edition of the cards it appears in. And actually I added a card on shame to the 3rd edition of the theory cards, which came out I think early this year or maybe very late last year. So it didn't hit, the shame theory didn't hit the theory cards until the 3rd edition. If you don't have the 3rd edition, there is an expansion pack, which I think the team will explain in the chat for me now. But this whole, I think, growth around the theory base of shame could be seen in terms of the growth in popularity of Breanne Brown. If you haven't already done so, I would suggest to you that you watch her TED Talks. I think it's best to watch them in the order. The first one, The Power of Vulnerability, and the second one, Listening to Shame. We're going to use some of Breanne Brown's quotes tonight, and actually some of those quotations have influenced the content that we're going to go through tonight. And I've got to say to you, I am quite nervous about tonight and what I'm going to share, and I'm not normally as nervous as I am, so I don't know if I'm wittering a little bit, but I am quite nervous about some of the things that I'm going to share tonight, and that's because shame is often hidden. We often don't want to talk about elements of shame, and I'm going to share a story of shame with you tonight. So Breanne Brown talks a lot about what she sees as being the very difference between guilt and shame. These two emotions are very often tied together, and people very often see them as two sides of the same coin. But actually, Brown says that they are two different emotions, and our starting point for thinking about the theory base of shame needs to be about separating guilt and shame. And according to Brown, Guilt is an adaptive emotion, and it can be useful. It helps us to adapt, and it can be useful for us in our lives because it helps us to hold up something that we've done or something that we failed to do. It helps us to hold that up against our values. So it helps us in a way to think about what we've done against our values, or our code, if you like, our moral compass, it's sometimes referred to as. Whereas shame is an intensely painful emotion. It leaves us feeling that we're not worthy of connection, or we're not worthy of love. And tonight, when we're talking about shame, we're going to talk a lot about connection and love, because they're an essential aspect of shame. The way I see it, guilt is a feeling about something you've done, but shame is associated with who you are. So it's almost like guilt is, I did a bad thing. Shame, I am a bad person. So guilt can be externalized, while shame is very often internalized. It's therefore very often hidden because it's an internalized emotion. So Breanne Brown developed shame resilience theory, which is sometimes referred to as SRT. In America particularly, they like to use sort of initials to refer to theories. So often you'll see it written as SRT. One thing I think we need to be very conscious of, and I've talked about a lot in the webinars, is where does the theory base come from? And I've always talked a lot about the fact that the theory base often comes from white middle-class men. But we need to recognise Breanne Brown is a woman, and her original study focused specifically on women. So the research behind SRT in the initial stages was all entirely focused on women's experiences. And she said of women that triggers for shame could be caused by appearance and body image, by sexuality, by family, motherhood, parenting, professional identity and work, mental and physical health, by aging, by religion, by speaking out, and by surviving trauma. A huge numbers of triggers that she identified. As shame resilience theory has developed, she's talked about the way in which triggers to theory are very personal and are unique to individuals and differ within cultures. I think it's important for us to go back to this image, which has appeared a couple of times in the webinars, to remind us that we need to see a person in the context of their relationships, their community, their society, their environments, and to recognize that shame is about us as an individual, but it's also about where does that come from in terms of our environments, our relationships, our community, our connections with services, for example. So shame resilience theory, Brown says there are 4 steps in terms of shame resilience. And the 4 steps are identified there on that image as steps. And the steps, she says, are the first step in terms of shame resilience is that we need to recognize our personal vulnerability that's led to feelings of shame. So we need to look inwardly at what is our vulnerability, what's our individual vulnerability. But we then need to recognize external factors that have led to feelings of shame. I think you can tell straight away that Breanne Brown, in developing this, is a social worker, because it's all about seeing the individual in the context of their environment, looking at external factors. The third stage is about the importance of connecting with others to both receive empathy, but also to offer empathy to others, because shame resilience theory suggests that both receiving and giving of empathy can help us to work through feelings of shame. And the fourth step is that we need to discuss and deconstruct the feelings of shame themselves. And I suppose for me as a social worker, that word deconstructing is perhaps one of the most important there. As social workers, we have to understand how shame is constructed or built so that we can then help people to deconstruct that shame, those feelings of shame. But a word that's appeared many times in the webinar so far, both if you look back at the slides, you'll see it verbally on the slides, but also if you listen back to what we've said, not just to tonight's webinar, but to what we call ourselves as a webinar team. This is all about connections. Connect, connect, connect. I use that word constantly in social work. And step 3 is all about connecting with others. One of the key things that we want to do in these webinars is to help people to connect together as social workers. And so we have connected. We are very fortunate that Jason, after we read his tweets, agreed that he would come and do a practitioner spotlight for us tonight. So I'm going to hand over to Jason at this point, who will share his thoughts around shame at this point in the webinar. Is that okay to hand over to you then, Jason?
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so just to say hello to everyone who is taking part in the webinar live. I'm really chuffed to be here. As I said, I've listened and taken part in other webinars and watched them afterwards, and just been so impressed with the group and the way you are all connecting with each other around important topics. So just thank you again to the team for inviting me to be here. My name is Jason. I'm Irish from Northern Ireland. I'm a social worker. I'm a practice educator. I've worked as a practice assessor and also a trainer. And at the moment, I'm working as a practice educator with older looked after children and unaccompanied asylum seekers in supported lodgings placements. I've worked in a variety of different settings here in England over the past 10 years. In child protection, yeah, with older looked after children and care leavers. And I really love being part of the social work profession. And I think it gives you such a unique opportunity to be involved in people's lives, to support them and to understand where they're coming from. And I think the main reason probably why I'm finding myself now as part of this webinar is because of some tweets that I tweeted at the start of last month. And as Siobhan has alluded to, I think talking about your personal experiences can cause you to feel quite nervous. And the experiences that I have had relate to the topic of shame. And I'm really happy that we're talking about the topic of shame, because in my opinion, we are not talking about it enough in social work. And it's quite a powerful emotion, both for practitioners and also for parents and children and young people who we work with. So the tweets that I sent out talked a little bit about my experience as a child, and the fact that I had a social worker myself. And believe it or not, and it may seem strange because I work in the social work profession, but over the past 10 years, I have actually not mentioned that to any of my colleagues or to any of the families or people that I work with. And it's given me pause for reflection recently as to the reason why I felt like either I didn't want to or I felt unable to share that information. But yeah, as a child, I had a social worker involved in my life due to conflict in my family. And disagreements about where myself and my two siblings should live when we were children. And as I alluded to in my tweets, if you've seen those, as a child, I felt overwhelmed and so aware of the power that that social work professional had in my life. And that is something that I've been reflecting on, and I think that it's useful for all of us as social work practitioners to reflect on that. When they came to visit me in my home, I was just really aware of the fact that they had the huge power over my life to make decisions about where I should live, and also to make potential judgments about me, about my family, and what it meant for me to have a social worker involved in my life. As I said in my tweets, thankfully they did not visit me in school, because for me personally, that is something that I would have found unfathomable. I can't imagine I think I would have felt mortified for a social worker to come and visit me in school. And you know what? I don't remember a huge amount of what that social worker talked to me about or what they asked me, but what has lived with me for quite a long time is that feeling of having to have a social worker involved with my family. And it's quite powerful. And I think sometimes as practitioners, we take it for granted that even just having a social worker allocated or having the intervention of social workers is in and of itself, for many people, a source of shame. And I don't think that we reflect on that enough as practitioners, because for many of us, it can indicate, or we have an anxiety that that will come to define us in some way in terms of our identity. So as a young child, I was left thinking, you know, what does this represent about me? What does it say about me and my family that we require a social worker in our lives? And so my challenge, I suppose, to social work practitioners is to be really engaging in this topic and thinking around shame and how our influence in people's lives and our presence in people's lives can have a huge, profound impact that sometimes I think we don't take time to reflect upon. And I've really felt that in my own life, in that I didn't feel comfortable talking about the fact that I had a social worker, even though I was a social worker myself many years later, and I was surrounded by social work professionals. And I've asked myself the question as to why that might be the case. And I think, if I'm honest, there's too often in social work an us and them kind of mentality. And that's not always the case. And that's not necessarily a reflection on how my social worker was with me or my family, because in fact, I think they were quite good and their intentions were good. But I think what's important for us in social work is to really interrogate our actions and our values and not take for granted that it's going to be okay, for example, to go and visit a child in their school. Because when the social worker was asking me questions about my family, about my life, about where I wanted to live, of course, I was very suspicious about why they were asking me this question and what they were going to do with that information. And I watched the webinar previously where Annie talked about some of her experiences being asked when, for example, she changed the bed sheets and those types of questions. And when you're in that circumstance, you may be asking questions as a social worker just maybe to get to know the child. You may be doing a piece of direct work, which is a day in the life of the child, where you're just trying to build a relationship and understand what their everyday life looks like. But I think what we need to be mindful of is that for many children, they will be very cautious and nervous and feel a sense of shame. You know, is this social worker going to judge me and my family if my children get up during the weekend in the afternoon? There's so many different questions that we don't think too much about. Sometimes as social workers, we actually can have very profound impacts. And what I've also been reflecting on in terms of shame is that I was fortunate in that my social worker looked like me, was also white, probably came from a similar background to myself. And actually, there are many people who experience services such as social services, the police, education, health, and their experience is not that people within those organizations are there to support and to help. And that can be based on experiences, for example, that people of color might have, because the research shows us, of course, that young people of color are more likely to be discriminated against when they apply for jobs, more likely to be excluded from school, more likely to be stopped and searched, more likely to be arrested and sent to jail. So in thinking about shame, it's important for me to put my experiences into the context of being able to work with someone who looked like me and of a similar background. And actually many children and young people may have a white middle-class social worker and come from a very different background. And something also that I think that is a challenge for us in social work is I can only walk in my shoes and you can only walk in yours. So I can understand the experiences that I have had, having lived experience with social services, and also as a gay man, I have been physically assaulted just for holding hands with my partner in public. So those are some of the experiences that I have had that can bring about that deep kind of shame and rage. But of course, I am not walking through this world as a person of colour, as a woman, as someone who's disabled. And so the challenge for us as social workers, when we work with such a big, broad variety of people, which is such a brilliant part of our work, is that we take the time to try and understand what our interventions may mean for different people. And that's why reflection in social work is so important, so that we can try and give time and give space to thinking and understanding how others are experiencing our questions and our involvement. And it's important, I think, in terms of understanding shame and working with young people and families, to be kind, but also I think, although that's vital, I think that it's not enough in and of itself. We have to understand our work within the political context and within the structures that we work in, which unfortunately operate too often to discriminate against people who are poor or disadvantaged or people of colour. And so I often say to my students and members of staff in my team that it's vital that we take the time and space for reflection to try and understand our own individual actions as practitioners, but also what we represent as being part of the social work profession.
I think it's that bit, isn't it, Jason, about being the person in environment is also the social worker in organisation. And we need to look at both of those and how those work together.
Absolutely.
Is it okay if I go back into some of the theory and then we can have some conversation around that? Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you.
At this point, because I think it takes us straight into that point. I've lost signal a couple of times, so I've been and repositioned, hoping I'm going to be okay. But if I lose signal, then it's going to be over to you at that point, Jason. So at the moment, I'm going to go, well, I have got a signal. I'm going to go into connecting things. I think you mentioned, Jason, there, Annie's story that we had in the webinar last week, and how I think the way that she was asked questions and the concepts and everything that was going on in her head, how questions can create shame. In other webinars, we've looked at moral injury, and moral injury creates shame for people in terms of power and empowerment, anti-oppressive practice. All of the webinars we've had so far, they all connect into shame. I think, as Jason just really illustrated there, the connections are really important. I would want us also to think about the connections between blame and shame. And that, I think, is really complex, because is it that blaming leads to shaming? Is it shame leads to blame? Which way round is it? Because I think where people feel blamed, then they experience shame, but equally shame is often blamed with people. So which comes first? It's almost chicken and egg, the shame and blame. And I think the construction of shame, therefore, is incredibly complex, and it is definitely something that we need to think about. And I'm just thinking about going back to the point you were making, Jason, about understanding social workers in their political environment is social workers' experience of shame as well. That whole blame culture and the way in which we as social workers, I think, in a lot of the media, are blamed for what's happening in situations. So if we sort of think about the people that we work with and seek to support, often feel a sense of shame. But social workers can feel a sense of shame even about being a social worker. I don't know if you know social workers like this, Jason, but I know social workers who, when they are asked, what do you do for a living, will not say, I'm a social worker. There's almost a sense of shame about being a social worker. And I was really interested reading around the theory base of shame to find this article by Frost, who talked about social workers experiencing shame when they're forced to practice in ways which are experienced as punitive by service users. So we come into social work, don't we, wanting to be supportive, wanting to engage in early help. And when we're not able to do that because of the political forces that surround us, we can feel a sense of shame. We feel almost like we're not doing what we want to do as social workers. And then I don't know how you deal with this as a manager, Jason, but that whole thing also, that employing organisations and managers can actually add to shame with, you know, we need to have quality assurance, but is there a sense of a blame culture in organisations? You know, I know some social workers who tell me that there is a shame sheet. They actually call it a shame sheet, where it's almost like, well, you didn't get all of your referrals, didn't get through all your referrals, didn't get all the assessments done, or your case notes aren't up to date, and there's a sense of shaming of social workers within a quality assurance process. So I think that social workers can experience shame too. And I think that's going to be exaggerated by moral injury, which we've talked about in some of the webinars, which we know creates feelings of both guilt and shame. I don't know if you would agree with that, Jason, but I do think that there's aspects of shame that social workers feel. So just looking at how it connects, it's not just about us understanding shame in terms of how the people we support might feel. It's also about thinking about how we ourselves might feel as part of a system that is blamed, you know, in society, but also isn't working necessarily the way we want to work. So shame and blame are connected together. And then this is a theory around shame. So I'm just going to return to this, and then I'm going to share my story of shame. And then Jason and I can maybe do some comparisons of our stories of shame. But I don't know if you felt this applied to your experiences as a child, Jason. My experiences are as an adult, yours are as a child, so it's going to be interesting for us to explore this. But when I read this theory, which is an old theory from the 1990s, Nathanson's Compass of Shame, where Nathanson basically builds on shame as being a kind of fight or flight. So you get these different poles. The flight, the disappearing, is the kind of withdrawal or avoidance poles. So according to Nathanson, we either, I suppose, do the flight, which gives us either a withdrawal or avoidance pole. It gives us 4 poles, and withdrawal means we isolate ourselves and we hide away from the situation because of the shame. Whilst at the avoidance pole, then we're in denial and we'll distract ourselves from the pain of shame, possibly through behaviours such as drug misuse. And then the other 2 poles are more I suppose, what we would describe as the fight. So we attack, we go on the attack when we feel a sense of shame, and we either attack ourselves or we attack others. Now, I felt when I read that, it applied very clearly to my own experiences of shame. And so from this point, I suppose I wanted to maybe share my story of shame. So the compass of shame, if we think about what a compass does, so there's a whole illustration of the compass of shame and what can happen with that compass of shame. The idea of a compass is that people often use a compass to direct a journey, don't they? I mean, I'm not someone who goes off orienteering. I don't know if you are, Jason, but people go off, don't they, hiking with a compass. And a compass is seen as it directs you, it tells you where to go. And I think that shame can direct our lives, and it can act as a major detour on any life journey. And so as part of that, and Breanne Brown's quotation that you either walk inside your story and you own it, or you stand outside your story and you hustle for your worthiness. And I'm going to stand inside my story tonight, and this is what I'm actually quite nervous about. I've never shared quite as much as I'm going to share tonight about my story of shame. And it gives you that whole sense of how does it feel to share your innermost secret. Do you remember last week when Annie said, what's your most innermost secret? And close your eyes, and now I'm going to ask one of you. Do you remember what those feelings were? I'm actually getting sweaty palms, and I'm quite nervous about what I'm going to share. and I'm going to share my story of shame. I think in previous webinars, we've talked about the P's, haven't we? That we all have the following P's. We have a private P, we have a personal P, we have a professional P, and we have a public P. You know, as people who attend the webinars, you see my professional P. You see aspects of my public P on social media. The Social Work Student Connect team see parts of my personal P because we share things when we're together as a team. My private P will always be private. I'm never going to go into sharing elements of that. But tonight in the webinar, I want to share aspects of my personal P, my story. And as I'm experiencing this, I'm reflecting in action, and I'm even thinking about, why have I minimized even what I view on the screen in front of me? Is I can sometimes watch people, so I can see the Social Work Student Connect team when they're looking at me. I've switched that all off so that I can't see anybody, and I've just got it so that all I can see now is Jason. And is that about a sense of shame and what you don't want to share? Is that about hiding, literally, figuratively, as we're talking? But I'm going to share a story, and so every story starts with once upon a time. Every week I plan the webinars and I think, what will we do this week? And so after last week's webinar, I started planning this week's webinar. That's how it works. But at the same time, I was also thinking about, I don't know if any of you have it, where on your phone memories will pop up, and this memory popped up because 7 years ago this week, I was at, well, last week actually, the end of last week, I was in Iceland, and the love of my life proposed to me in Iceland. That photograph was taken that day. I'm not on there, you can't go hunting for me, I took the photo, so I'm not actually in that photo. But that's what happened for me 7 years ago on Friday. That's what happened, and it was a wonderful day, full of joy. Less than 3 weeks later, I was in hospital following a major stroke. I had a very major stroke caused by a vertebral arterial dissection. I was unable to communicate verbally when I had the stroke. For quite a long time, I couldn't communicate in words. I could make sounds, so I suppose that's verbal communication, but there were no words forming. Then my verbal communication was very repetitive. I had real major problems with word finding. I lost the ability to read and write. I was unable to use the right-hand side of my body. The whole of the right-hand side of my face was drooped. I couldn't walk. I couldn't get out of bed unaided. There were lots of things that happened as a result of having the stroke. And in Van Vliet's 2008 study, Van Vliet said that shame can paralyze a person. But here I was, actually physically, properly, really paralyzed, not by shame, but by a stroke. And I was, quite frankly, completely terrorized as well as terrified. I was terrified. And you can tell that I'm now nervous because I'm now losing my words, which still happens to me as a result of the stroke. So I still have a number of things that have happened to me as a result of the stroke. But when I think about what happened then and how it impacted on my relationships, as soon as I could communicate verbally again, I withdrew my acceptance of the love of my life. I said, I'm not going to marry you. And there was a whole, physically trying to get my ring to give him back. All of those kinds of things were really difficult because physically I couldn't get the ring off my finger, and I wanted to, because I kept saying, I can't let you marry me now. It was the way I saw myself, I suppose. So I was going into all four of those things. I was avoiding, I was hiding away, I was attacking my partner and my family verbally, nurses and doctors I would get very angry towards. I was, I suppose in a way, self-attacking in terms of I overate. I did lots of things during that time. And during the following 2 years, then I was really significantly supported by my family through lots and lots of love and patience and listening. Listening was probably the key thing. Support, perseverance from my family, and challenge during that time following the stroke, such that 2 years later, that photograph was taken, and that photograph means a huge deal to me. One of the things that is the result of the stroke is I cannot wear high heels. I really wanted to be able to wear a heel on my wedding day, so I can't walk in a high heel, so I put those on, and Simon, who is now my wonderful husband, carried me so that I could wear those shoes just for a photograph. And so that's why that photograph has been taken, and it brings great joy to me to look at it. But that whole experience, that story of me having the stroke, getting to that point, I wanted to share tonight, because I want to share with you what created shame. Because I think the most important thing, and I'm then going to go back as well and have a conversation with Jason about this, is it wasn't what happened to me that created the shame. It wasn't my story, it was other people interacting with my story that created the shame. So Breanne Brown's quotation is, I now see how owning our story and loving ourselves through that process is the bravest thing that we'll ever do. And I think I'm hoping I'm being quite brave tonight in sharing my story. But I asked Rosie, lots of you who come to the webinars will know that my daughter Rosie does the illustrations for the slides, and I asked her to put that quote into an image for me, and this is the image she sent me. And I know exactly why she sent me this image, and it's because I have always used the following quotation, and we now use it as a family, that life isn't about waiting for the storm to pass, but it's about learning how to dance in the rain. And actually not waiting for something to pass, but knowing how to deal with it at a time is a key part of our family scenario. I think owning our story is really important, but being able to love ourselves within that story. And for me, the whole aspect is all hanging, the whole idea around the theory of shame, for me, has to hang on the concept and idea of love. And that's why I wanted to introduce that story, which is a story of love. Monday, we celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary. So what created my shame? That's what I want us to explore. And I'm going to maybe come back as well and ask Jason about his experiences of shame as a child. My experiences of shame are as an adult. So some of you work with children, some of you work with adults. You may be able to draw different things from our shared stories. But you might think that the shame that I experienced was created by the impairment or by the impact of the stroke, the loss of abilities. That did not create the shame. What created shame was the professional response to my situation. So the use of questions from professionals, including social workers, the use of questions like, can you feed yourself? How are you mobilizing? How are you managing your transfers? They created significant shame. When we start the Wednesday webinars, Kelly doesn't say, what have you fed yourself for your tea? Kelly says, what have you had for your tea? Kelly does not say, what have you fed yourself? People do not feed themselves. People eat. Animals, we feed animals. We feed babies. So immediately, as an adult person, I was being treated and spoken about as though I was a child or as though I was an animal. It created shame. Statements like, you need to come to terms with what's happened to you. Your life is going to be different from now on. Hearing people say things like, oh, it's so sad, isn't it? Or isn't it tragic? You would hear people standing around the bed saying that. I could hear nurses talking about me saying, oh, it's really tragic, isn't it, what's happened to her? Those kinds of things, that created shame. Pressure to meet rehabilitation targets that to me had no meaning. To me, my target was I wanted to relearn to read and write because I wanted to come back to work. And what I would be told was, you're never going to go back to work. You simply need to come to terms with what's happened to you. There was no work on here's how to relearn to read and write. The targets that were set for me were about, and obviously it was their language, not mine, can you independently mobilize up 3 steps? I have no idea why it was up 3 steps. Who's got 3 steps in their house? But that was the target that was given to me. I could be discharged from rehab if I could independently mobilise up 3 steps. I couldn't care if I could mobilise up 3 steps. I wanted to relearn to read and write. Simon taught me to relearn to read and write. No professional engaged in that. Other things that really impacted on my shame was the use of jargon, just complete jargon in a measurement of my experiences. The monitoring of bodily functions. I actually asked Simon, clearly I wanted to ask him if I could share aspects of our story, our relationship story, but I always ask him to proofread things for me because my reading is impacted more now. And he said, oh, maybe you don't want to say bodily functions because that's about, you know, use of the toilet generally. He said maybe you need to think about what you're trying to say is the way your body functions. But actually then I thought, well, do you know what, they also just always talking to you about toileting, so maybe I will just leave bodily functions in. It's another whole phrase that gets used in stroke rehab services. You're no longer seen as a person. Decisions that were being made about me without me, professionals setting outcomes, those are the things that created shame. Shame was not created by having a stroke. Having a stroke gave me an impairment. Having a stroke has left me with things like some things that you may have seen about me but have no idea. So you might notice, I've noticed when watching myself back on YouTube, I've always got a tissue, and the reason I've always got a tissue is I can't feel my face and I worry that my nose is running, and so I constantly do that to make sure that I'm left with lots of things. I'm left still with problems with reading. I read things in a very different way. I read things mirror image, so I'm left with lots of things. Those things don't create shame. People's responses to me are what creates shame. So Jason, I don't know if that's resonates with your story and what created shame for you. Is that similar, that the shame is created from outside rather than from within? Or
Yeah, just to say, Siobhan, that's really powerful what you've shared, and I can definitely relate to the feelings of anxiety and apprehension about sharing those personal things that have had that impact and made you feel shame. It's not easy to talk about that. Yeah, I would tend to agree, really. You know, in terms of being at the receiving end of social work interventions, it was that sense of what would other people think, and also how does this what does this say about me, what does this say about my family that this is required. You know, and I know from talking to many parents as well, for example, that even just having a social worker involved can, for many people, be, you know, feel as though they're being made to feel really as if they're not good enough as a parent. And that can bring a real sense of frustration, anger, shame at being made to feel in that way.
Absolutely. It's that, I think it's very often the external responses, I think, that can create that. I'm also very conscious now that I've had to move my phone to try and make sure we've got signal, and I've no way of keeping an eye on time anymore. So I'm hoping someone else will keep an eye on time, or maybe, I don't know, if Chris will pop up or something in a minute and tell me how time's going, as well as tell me on Q&A. So somebody keep me to time, someone on the team keep me to time if I don't have, because I've left my phone somewhere to make sure I keep signal because I kept losing it. How are we doing for time, Chris? I've just shared that story, so I want to...
We're at 5 to 8 nearly, so
okay.
Not too bad. And there's a couple of questions when you're ready for them.
Okay, so can I just go into the next little bit and come back to you for questions?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I think there, both Jason and I have shared elements of ourself, and as Jason's just said, it's very hard to share things about yourself, isn't it? And that sense of shame creates that I can't share this around myself. And I think identity and our individual identity is partly made up as an expression of what we might call cognitive functions, and all of these relate to our sense of ourself and who we are. So self-image is essentially about how we see ourselves or how we describe ourselves. Self-respect is about how much respect we have for ourselves. Self-esteem is about how we value ourselves, and self-confidence is about how much confidence we have in ourselves. And those are four functions, cognitive functions, but they all overlap. And those key things, I think, have a huge impact. Shame has a major impact on all of those things, on our self-image, on our self-esteem, on our self-respect, on our self-confidence. So one of the things that I think that we can do as social workers is recognize that shame is often an emotion about self, but actually external factors can have a huge impact on that. So if we look at how can we support people's self-image, self-esteem, self-respect and self-confidence, if we hold people in esteem, that will build their self-esteem. If we have confidence in people, that will build their self-confidence. If we respect people, that will build their self-respect. So we can draw out of these some of the actions that we can take to support people. Certainly others having confidence in me has built my confidence. Others holding respect for me has built my self-respect. Professionals did not build my self-respect. My contact with professionals diminished my own sense of self and my own self-respect. So what we need to do as professionals, what can we do as professionals? And this is my advice as to what we can do as professionals. And when we get to the end of this, I'm going to ask Jason for his advice as well on what we can do as professionals. So firstly, I'd say, well, look, let's just name the elephant. Let's think about and speak about shame. Let's not hide shame in social work. Let's reflect on the impact of shame. What does shame make people do? How does shame lead to behaviours? Use compassion and empathy and always be professionally kind. There is no excuse for not being professionally kind. There are a lack of resources in social work, but kindness does not need resources. Kindness is about ourselves, being professionally kind. We can employ rights-based practice. We can promote people's rights. We can employ relationship-based practice and work on the development of relationships. We can hold connected conversations with people. We can seek to challenge oppression. The more that we challenge oppression, the more that people will have self-esteem. Don't blame shame. So if somebody does not want to engage with you, don't say they're difficult to engage. Think about the fact that somebody may feel shame about engaging with services. Why not think about, I am finding it hard to engage with that person, rather than the person is difficult to engage. The more that we blame the person, they are difficult to engage, the more shame will be created. So don't blame shame. Enable people to tell their stories, but to tell their stories in their own words, and help them to own those stories. I'm sure that Simon would tell the story of our getting engaged and through those 2 years to getting married in a very different way than I've told the story. But the story is my story. His story is his story. Enable people to tell stories in their own words and enable them to own their stories. And then I'm going to talk as well about recognition and the 3 stages of recognition that we must employ as social workers. But I'm going to sort of draw the theory base and the webinar to a conclusion with the recognition side. So at this point, I'm just going to ask Jason what your advice is around what we can do as professionals around the area of shame. Because theory, we've talked in the webinars a lot about theory helps you to understand something, but it doesn't say here's what to do about it. Models are here's what to do about it, but there is no model of shame. You know, there's no model of how to work with shame. There's theories of helping us to understand shame. But then how do we respond? What do we do? And so I suppose from your perspective, Jason, what are your thoughts around what we should be doing about shame?
I can see, I think it was much earlier in the webinar, but someone has mentioned the work of Matthew Gibson around shame, which I personally have drawn upon for my social work practice, and he writes about shame and guilt in child protection. I think that that's his recommendations are relevant to so many different areas of practice, and he talks about shame reducing social work practice, which is, I think, is something that we need to be conscious of. So my recommendations are based largely on the work of Matthew Gibson, and one of those recommendations is about first understanding shame. Understanding that shame is often present in our interactions with the people that we're working with, and that can largely be due to the particular contexts of people's lives in relation to poverty and disadvantage for various different reasons. I think a key practical element for us as practitioners when we're working with families is to have clarity about our involvement, and why are we visiting, why are we involved, what are our concerns, what are we going to do, what are our goals. So often, unfortunately, I think we are not clear, and actually the feedback that we get from children and from families is, I don't know why they were visiting us, I don't know what the problem is, I don't know where we're supposed to get to, I don't know what is going to be good enough so that this social worker is not going to be visiting me anymore. And when we have that clarity, I think we can try and move from a sense of potentially feeling judged or shamed and actually focus on the actions. You know, these are the actions potentially that are putting this child at risk, or these are the actions potentially putting you at risk, and these are the ways that we might be able to get around that, to mitigate that. Relationship building and connection, I'll not spend any longer on that because Siobhan, you've obviously articulated that beautifully, not just in what you've said, but in the fact that this group exists. And also recognizing cues of shame, I think, is very important, because as a young child, there maybe were things that I wanted to say, but I felt unable to say due to those feelings of shame. And I think when we acknowledge that, that can sometimes remove the legitimacy of shame and support that parent, if that's the context, to understand that we're there to provide support, and also to create a support network around the family. I think that is something that really can help to eliminate shame. If a woman, for example, is experiencing domestic abuse and feels isolated, or is isolated by the perpetrator, it can be so powerful as a social worker to help develop those connections around that person. And also, just to say, in terms of our direct work with children, that we're really clear and we emphasize to those children that they haven't done anything wrong. You know, having a social worker come to visit or speaking with a social worker does not mean that they've done something wrong, or there's something inherently wrong with them or the way their family operates. So those are some of the things that I've drawn upon in my practice and that I think can be quite useful for us to think about.
That'd be great. Thanks, Jason. And we're going to send those resources out to people, aren't we, in the follow-up email, some links to the references that you've made there and the resources that you use. So thank you for that. So I'm going to go into recognition then, in terms of what I see as being a really important element of social work is all about recognition. And this goes right back to the 1990s. And I find myself increasingly going back to some of the theory base from, you know, more than 20 years ago. And then I think, is this because I'm some kind of dinosaur of a social worker? But some of it is so relevant, I think, still, and is still being drawn on and being used. And I think sometimes it makes it's clearer to go back to, I suppose, the very basis that we've since worked on. So Honneth in 1995 says there's 3 aspects of recognition. And those 3 aspects of recognition are, at an individual level, recognition is derived from love and care for the individual, which promotes emotional well-being. I remember in the Art of Analysis webinar when Yusuf shared his very powerful story with us and talked about his experiences of shame. His view was love is the healer of all. Love is really important for people. The second level, according to Honneth, is concerned with social and political rights, where the individual is accorded respect and is able to be involved in decision making and is able to exercise citizenship. So it's all about social and political rights. And finally, the third level involves valuing an individual's skills and talents and an appreciation of their contribution to their own community and social life. So you've got these three aspects of recognition if we go right back to the 1990s. And the little images there that I've had drawn up, those images, I write a little note to Rosie saying, can you draw this? Can you draw a love heart with a hug around it? Can you draw a thumbs up? Can you? And what I realized when she sent them back to me, I realized there is something that connects all of these three images. And I didn't ask for those. I didn't have that in my mind when I asked her to draw the images. I only saw the connection when the images came back. I don't know if any of you see the same connection between those three images that I just wanted as little icons to demonstrate the three aspects of recognition. But the thing that connects those is hands. And this is hands-on stuff. We can do something about this. We can change shame, and we can change the amount of shame that there is in social work. I love that phrase that you used, Jason, that from Matthew Gibson around shame reduction in social work. And I think that's a really important aspect in social work. So those three aspects of recognition offer a framework, according to Houston, of 2016. So now we're back up to the more recent references. Those three aspects of recognition offer a framework for social work practice and an approach to understanding suffering and to the struggle that people have to construct meaningful identities for themselves. It's that whole bit about a sense of self. And connecting us back to last week's webinar, where there was a lot of conversation, I think, really about shame and the impact of shame. In last week's webinar, we talked about 3 being the magic number, and those 3 aspects of recognition are so important for social workers. So take those 3 as the 3 main methods, I suppose, of shame reduction in a way. And Mumford and Sanders in 2020, really recently, they say we've got to understand the practices of misrecognition, of not being respected, of people not receiving love and care, of people not having a voice that's heard and valued, and the impact of that misrecognition on individuals and communities. And from the anti-racist webinar, you may recognise this image painted by Yusuf, who was with us in the Art of Analysis. That illustrates, I think, more strongly than anything I've ever seen in social work, that demonstrates the impact of misrecognition, the impact on the sense of self, on self-worth, on self-value, on self-confidence. Misrecognition leads to all of that. So in my view, what we actually need to demonstrate, I suppose, shame reduction in practice is, I would say, that we need a revolution of love in social work. We need to put love back on the agenda. We need to have professional kindness in social work. We need to focus on the importance of love of others. We need to involve family who demonstrate love for people. We need to have whole love focused work in our practice. And that revolution of love takes us into this picture, which for me demonstrates the way in which I now read. Since my stroke, I read in a mirror image formation. So I see words in very different ways than I saw words before, because I've had to relearn to read them through a kind of mirror image. I learned with a mirror to start off with. So for me, what I see in that is the word love straight away. And I also see the word revolution in it very, very clearly, love and revolution within that. And so we do need a revolution of love, and that has to start with a recognition. It has to start with a recognition of where people are at and the value of every single human being that we work with. When we value individuals, and I want to, suppose, in a way, conclude where we started. And this is a very powerful quotation, I think. This is not bigger than us. This is us. Yes, we need to own 1 million heartbreaking stories of discrimination and prejudice. And we need to make millions of changes. And we need to hold space for 1 million tough conversations. But if each one of us owns one story and makes one change and has one honest conversation, where we listen more than we defend or offer false comfort. We can do this. And I want us to just conclude, I suppose, thinking about that. This is us, because there is no us and them. There is only us. And I think that's really important in terms of thinking about shame and where shame comes from. And so at this point, again, I'm still not sure about time, because to keep my internet connection, I've had to move my phone, which is what I normally use for time.
It's 10
But
past
Chris,
8.
you said there were some questions.
Yeah.
We've got maybe 5 minutes or so for questions and answers. So are there any particular questions that you think are really important for us to answer tonight?
We've got quite a lot of questions, and I did post a comment into the chat just to let people know that anything we can't get to tonight while we're live, we'll try and see if we can address them in our follow-up email, just to give us an opportunity to, you know, answer them properly. But there have been a number of questions where people have asked about cultural competence in terms of shame and in terms of addressing that. So, you know, for example, theories that are mainly devised by white middle class men being applied in different cultural settings, and how to address that.
I suppose what I would say is we need to look at cultural humility, I think, more than cultural competence, and demonstrate that whole, and I think there's another whole webinar on cultural humility. Right. But you know, I keep talking about every week, let's challenge the fact that all the theories that we're using are by white middle class men, and it is important that we do challenge that. And I suppose what I would say is that I would look at what shame is and where shame comes from in different cultures and how to address that. I definitely think some very practical things, like the use of language, like supporting people in ways which demonstrate a sensitivity and a humility around culture, I think are important. Because I'm developing my tech skills as we go on each week, I've also pulled up the questions myself. I think I've got one here. I know I've got really clever at this, aren't I, Chris? I think I've got one here about how can we adjust the language that we use to mitigate.
That was going to be the next one I brought you.
Okay, thank you for that, Chris. We're great minds must think alike. Okay, what I would say is use the same language. If you look at the quotation that's on the screen now, this is us. Use the same language you would use for yourself. You don't think to yourself, oh, I'm just going to go and pop and toilet myself now. What do you say? You think, I'm just going to nip to the loo. I'm just going to go to the toilet. So ask somebody, how do you use the toilet? How are you getting on with going to the toilet, rather than are you toileting yourself? Don't say to somebody, how are you feeding yourself? Talk about how are you eating? What kinds of things are you eating? How do you manage with eating? Use the same language that you would use about yourself. So if you go home, if you're tonight, if you've not already had your tea, like Kelly asked you, if you've not already had your tea, if you're going to finish the webinar tonight and go and feed yourself your tea, by all means, tomorrow ask someone, how are you feeding yourself? But I am absolutely convinced you are not going to go and feed yourself your tea. You're going to go and eat your tea. So tomorrow, when you're talking to service users, use the same language. How are you eating your tea? How do you eat? Use the same language. So there is no reason for us to construct this language, because I would call it the language of shame from my perspective. So use the same language you would use for yourself. Break it down.
Also, in terms of writing assessments and so on, Siobhan, I'm sure the students and practitioners who are listening will recognize that sometimes there's a pressure to kind of make things, to put things in a very professional way. And I think as you develop your confidence as a practitioner, you begin to realize that actually to say something simply and to explain something clearly can actually be very challenging. And when you're not hiding behind terminology and lingo, and you have to say very clearly what you think and what your views are, that can be a real challenge. And I think we need to be encouraged by our practice educators and managers and the people around us to be clear and be straightforward.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Jason. I think people feel under pressure sometimes, don't they, to use that language because they hear other people using it. They feel like it makes us a professional, whereas actually I think the best professionals use language which is easy to understand. It's the language that we would all use, and that's the best kind of language that you see in really good assessments as well. So yeah. Is there anything else, Chris, that you feel we really need to do before we conclude? Because we normally like to finish around about now, don't we? So
there has been just one other kind of query that's come up, is that you know, some people feel that actually what if their story implicates other people, and wondering how they can get around that side of things.
You mean if someone...
I'm not sure I know what that question means.
Yeah, okay. Perhaps we'll come back to that with...
I think to say on that, if, for example, if someone has experienced abuse or something like that, then they should and should be encouraged to speak up about their experiences. It may be, for example, if that is happening to go through court at the moment, that you're not able to make mention of people's names and those kinds of details. But I would always encourage people in safe spaces to speak up and share their story, because it can be very empowering and can be quite liberating.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think I suppose that's a really important point that Jason's made there, is about safe spaces. How do we create safe spaces? And one of the things that I'm struck by, and one of the things that I've been talking to the team about doing in a future webinar, is doing a webinar around social workers who have a lived experience, and how much of that do we share and how much of that don't we share, and where is a safe space to share that, because there are so many social workers who have a lived experience, and I know that's something that you're really interested in, Jason, and there's a safe space that you're creating around that, which I think is really important. And I think we learn more then about experiences of people who experience social work providing social work. I think there's a great deal for us to learn from that. So at that, we will try, and I think to me what it shows is, I can just see a number on the bottom of the Q&A. It seems to be the largest number of questions that we've had in any webinar. So there could be two things. It could be, one thing could be, this is a huge topic that people are not getting enough information about and people want to know more about. Or it could be that I've not explained the theory base very clearly, and that's why there's lots of questions. I'm hoping it's because it's such an important topic that people want to know more about, and it may be something that we do want to revisit again later. What we will try and do is make sure that Jason and I have time to take a look at all of the questions, and we'll reflect on them and try and add something about our thoughts around those into the email, the follow-up email that we send out tomorrow, where we'll put all of the references in. Although, as you know, then I always like to give you the references on the slides. So the references sit there. I don't know if people ever take a quick photograph of them or something if you don't get them in any other way, but there's the references from the theory base that we've talked about tonight. Jason will send some references for Matthew Gibson's work around tomorrow, so you'll have plenty of references to go for. I'd suggest for all of those of you who are students, I saw a few people putting questions in about, I'm a student going on placement, how do I use shame? Well, just think about shame and explore shame in some of your writing. What do you think is the impact of shame? Our next couple of sessions coming up, because I know people like to register, and I think probably the team are already going to put into the chat box the registration link for next week's webinar. Next week, we're going to be looking at children impacted by immigration control, and we're going to explore knowledge, providing support and ethical challenges for social work. I think that's a really important webinar for us to consider at the moment. It's a very contemporary topic. That will be entirely a guest webinar, so that's going to be delivered next week. Well, the team will put some information into the chat, but that's going to be delivered next week by Nick, who I think has been here tonight in the chat with you. So Nick might quickly introduce himself in the chat, but Nick will be delivering that next week. So I'm really looking forward to listening to that. And the following week, we're going to be looking at self-care for social workers. I think we've done quite a few topics just recently about enabling us to explore and think about our own practice. But I think we will now have a night where we look at how do we look after ourselves and why do we need to look after ourselves, and there'll be lots of, I think, really important hints and tips in that webinar. So that's the next 2 Wednesdays around for us. I'm thinking that people will have put in the chat. I hope the team have put in the chat, here's how to register, ready for next week. Thank you ever so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for, as an audience, enabling a safe space for me to share aspects of my story that I have never shared before. Yes, we do have plans for a webinar on spirituality. I've just seen that, and it went too quickly through, but we do have plans for a webinar on spirituality. Any other webinar ideas that you have, please do just pop them into the chat. We do always have a look at them, and we're trying to keep things contemporary, but also add things that people want. So tonight was very much just an introduction to shame. Thank you so much to Jason for joining us, and I hope that people will start to think a little bit more about the impact of shame in social work. Let's not have it as an elephant in the room. So thanks ever so much, everybody, and good night.
Thank you.